Hello everyone. Did you know that 70% of the flowering plants need pollinators? Honeybees themselves are responsible for about $10 billion worth of pollination every year. Mango flowers are pollinated by bats, Rafflesia by elephants. Even cockroaches have been found to act as pollinators in 3 countries around the world, including China. Male mosquitoes, ants, beetles, moths, spiders, snails, lemurs, rodents and some other animals also have their hands, paws, tentacles and other parts of their body involved in pollination. So today in this video we are going to talk about pollination and pollinators and see how the flowers manage to attract the pollinators towards them. So what is pollination? Pollination is a process of physically transferring the pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower. And this is essential so that the male gamete produced inside the pollen grain can meet the female gamete which is present inside the ovary. During pollination, the pollen grains are discharged from the anther lobe and this can be carried by different agents or it can automatically fall on the stigma. On the basis of that, we have 2 different types of pollination. The first one is called self-pollination and the second one is called cross-pollination. Let's talk about self-pollination. Self-pollination is a type of pollination where the pollen grain from one flower falls on the stigma of the same flower or the stigma of another flower but of the same plant. Let's consider the first case. The first case in which the pollen grain falls from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower automatically by bending of the anther or the stamen on the stigma or the pistil results in union of male and female gametes of the same genetic type, and that is why this is self-pollination. Now this can be brought about in 2 ways. One, if the flower blooms but still the bending of the stamen is such that the pollen grain drops on the stigma of the same flower. The other one is that the flower never blooms. This is a flower, these flowers are called cleistogamous flowers. These are flowers which never bloom. So there is no opportunity of the pollen grain to go out of the flower. So in the first case where the stigma is getting pollinated by or the stigma is receiving the pollen grain from the anther of the same flower, this is known as autogamy. Right? So what is autogamy? Autogamy is a type of self-pollination where the pollen grain from the androecium of a flower falls on the stigma of the same flower. How? One, by when the flower blooms and the male part, that is the androecium, bends to drop the pollen on the stigma of the same flower. Or 2, where the flower does not bloom, so the androecium and gynoecium are trapped inside the flower and automatically the pollen grain drops on the stigma. The first type where the flower blooms, they are known as chasmogamous flowers. They are normal flowers which we see around us like sunflower, like banana, etc., where the flower does bloom but the male gamete forms or pollen grain falls on the stigma of the same flower. And the other type where the flower does not bloom is known as cleistogamous flowers. In cleistogamous flowers, like in case of oxalis, balsam, commelina, etc., the flower does not bloom, therefore the pollen grain has to fall on the stigma of the same flower. The other type of self-pollination is known as geitonogamy. In geitonogamy, we see that the pollen grain from one flower is falling on the stigma of a different flower which is present or born on the same plant. So basically you have one plant which has both male and female flower, and from the male flower the pollen grain is falling on the stigma of the female flower attached to the same plant. Now this is also genetically self-pollination. Why? Because if both the flowers are born on the same plant, they are genetically alike, which means that, for example, if you take your right hand and your left hand, they are 2 different hands but they are of the same genetic composition. Similarly, two flowers born on the same plant, they have the same genetic composition. So that is why this is regarded as self-pollination. But for this self-pollination, you might need someone to carry the pollen grain from the male flower to the female flower. So functionally, that is when it is actually happening, it might need a pollinating agent like cross-pollination. But genetically, it is self-pollination. So self-pollination, now we understand, can be of two types, autogamy and geitonogamy. The other type of pollination is called cross-pollination. And in cross-pollination, we see that pollen grain from one flower falls on the stigma of another flower of another plant, which can belong to the same species, different varieties, different genera, etc. Okay, so as long as they are closely related and the male gamete is capable of fertilizing the female gamete and produce a successful offspring, this pollination is called cross-pollination, where pollen grain from one flower pollinates the stigma of another flower of a completely different plant which belongs to a different species or a different genera or a different variety. Okay, so these are the two types of pollination. Now let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of cross and self-pollination. First, let's talk about the advantages of self-pollination. During self-pollination, since the pollen grain is falling on the stigma of the same flower or another flower very nearby attached to the same plant, therefore we see that the process of self-pollination is a much more surer process than cross-pollination. There is less wastage of pollen grains, there still is, but there is less wastage of pollen grain and the formation of seed is a much surer process than in cross-pollination. Also, if you do not want the genetic composition of the plant to change, let's say you have a variety of plant which has all the characteristics that you require. You wouldn't want it to cross-pollinate with another plant whose characteristics you are not sure of, because then there is a possibility that the characteristics of these two plants will come together in the next generation and you will not get all the desired varieties from the first plant. So in such cases, if you want to maintain that pure line, if you want to maintain that genetic composition, you would want the first plant or you would want your plant to carry out self-pollination so that the genetic constitution remains same, it does not get mixed with another unknown variety. However, this can also be a disadvantage of self-pollination. If you do not get variety, then there is a possibility that the characteristic features of these plants will not evolve. So you will not get new characteristic features, and we have seen most of the times that if you carry out self-pollination generation after generation, after a few generations, these plants lose their capacity of forming seeds. These plants are usually less adapted to environmental conditions. These plants lose their capacity of forming fruits and the health, they get attacked by insects and pests and fall sick much faster. Right? So that is one disadvantage, and therefore you will not be able to get more evolved, more adapted, more strong plants in the next generation. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, has its own disadvantages. What are the disadvantages? One, cross-pollination requires a pollinating agent to carry the pollen grain from one flower to the next. And such pollinating agents or finding such pollinating agents is an uncertainty. So cross-pollination therefore becomes way more uncertain than self-pollination. Another thing is, while carrying the pollen grain from one place to the other, if it is wind, water, insects, birds, doesn't matter. There's a lot of wastage. So a large number of pollen grains need to be formed, much more than what self-pollinating plants would produce. So that results in spending energy on the part of the plant to produce more number of male gametes to ensure seed production. So cross-pollination will not hold a pure line. It will not be a very sure process because it is dependent on pollinators, and it will also not be a very sure process, and it will also not be very energy efficient for the plant, because during cross-pollination the plant has to produce way more number of pollen grains than during self-pollination. Now let us talk about cross-pollination. What are the different agents that help in cross-pollination, and what are the characteristics of plants that contribute to an obligatory cross-pollination? Let's first talk about the different kinds of flowers on the basis of the pollinating agents. Let us talk about the characteristic features of an anemophilous flower. An anemophilous flower is one that is pollinated by wind, for example maize, for example grass, etc. Now, since it does not have to attract any animal towards itself for pollination and is simply carried by wind, these flowers are small and inconspicuous. However, they are also present in clusters or borne in an inflorescence, so that the moment a bunch of flower moves, there is a lot of pollen grain that can be carried by the wind. Needless to say, they also are colorless, odorless and nectarless because they do not need to be conspicuous, they do not need to attract pollinators. The male flowers are way more abundant because the possibility of wastage in wind pollinated flower, it is very high. Stigma and anther, they are always exerted, that is they project out of the flower so that they are in contact with the wind, and usually the anthers are versatile, that is they are loosely attached to the filament so that they can move, so that by a simple shaking of the wind pollen grain can go out. Pollen grains themselves are light and they are dusty, they are sometimes provided with wings, they have a smooth covering and usually they are non-sticky because being sticky might make them heavier. Stigma on the other hand is branched, hairy or feathered, so that they have a large surface area to be able to catch the pollen grain if any is floating through air. The pollen grains are, needless to say, produced in a very large number because wind movement is not directional. It can move towards the flower or not, and therefore wastage will be very high. The floral parts usually are inconspicuous and small, we have talked about it, and these are more or less the characteristic features of anemophilous flowers. So now if you see a flower which has these characteristic features, you will be able to quickly identify if they are wind pollinated or they are pollinated by some other agent. The next group of flower that we will talk about are the hydrophilous flowers. Now the name tells you, hydro meaning water, that these flowers are pollinated by water. Again, since it is not pollinated by an insect, you do not need the flower to be conspicuous, showy or containing a lot of nectar or odor. So these flowers are small, inconspicuous. The floral parts are usually unwettable because if they are wettable, they might rot. Okay, so they usually have a protective layer which makes them unwettable. They do not have nectar or odor because it is useless to have nectar or odor inside the water. The pollen grains are lightweight and unwettable too, and they are also provided with mucilage covering so that they remain protected. The stigma is branched so that it can take the pollen grain that is floating through water. Now only 30 genera of plants have been found to be water pollinated, and most of them are monocotyledonous plants. Let me give you an example of a classic example of a hydrophilous flower, that is Vallisneria. In Vallisneria we see that this is a completely submerged plant. Okay, the flowers are completely submerged and they remain inside the water. The male flower floats on the surface of the water, releasing the pollen grains on the surface of the water. During pollination, the female flower floats up because it is attached to a spring-like stalk, so that spring-like stalk opens up and the flower floats up so that the stigma can now come to the surface of the water and get in touch with or get the pollen grains from the surface of the water. After it has been pollinated, the female flower again goes down and the process of fertilization takes place inside the water. So these are some of the characteristic features of hydrophilous flowers. Now let us move on to entomophilous flower. The entomophilous flowers are pollinated by different types of insects, and as obviously it is very obvious that to attract insects towards the flower, the flower has to have some characteristic feature. One of them is having showy or bright petals or colors either in the petal. If the petal is not conspicuous, then some other part becomes showy. Maybe the sepals become showy, or maybe some leaf becomes showy, so that it can attract the insects towards the flower. If it is not color, then they might have other things, for example nectar or odor for attracting the insects. In these flowers, usually, depending on which species of entomophilous flower we are talking about, they usually have a landing platform for the insect, where the insect can come and land. We see a bilabiate personate flower of snapdragon have a particular weight carrying capacity. We see certain corolla having the depth which matches with the length of the tongue of tongued insects. So that these flowers are adapted so that the insect can come and sit, or so that the insect can project one of their body parts, for example teeth, etc., for example tongue, etc., so that it can take the pollen grains. Some flowers also have special markings on the petals which are called honey or nectar guides, which directs the the insects towards the source of nectar, which is usually located inside the flower. Odor may be pleasant or foul. If it is pleasant odor, for example in jasmine, it attracts insects. If it is foul odor, for example in rafflesia, then also it can attract certain insects. Nectars are secreted for feeding the visiting insects. So the flower has to provide with some kind of reward to the pollinator. It provides either nectar or edible pollens which these insects visit the flower for. And if the nectar glands are present, they are usually present deep inside the flower, so that the insect has to go into the flower, during which their body is dabbed with pollen grains. Now these pollen grains will have to stick to the body. So they are either spiny, they are usually slightly heavy, and they have a yellowish colored sticky substance surrounding it which is called pollen kit. All these help the pollen grain to attach to the body of the insect, and when the insect goes out and flies to another flower, there the stigma picks up these pollen grains from the body and legs of these insects. Alright, so an example is yucca. Yucca is usually it's a flower which is pollinated by a moth, and they cannot complete their life cycle. So the moth is dependent on yucca for its life cycle. Yucca is dependent on the moth for its pollination. So the moth has to visit yucca, and yucca needs the moth for pollination. This is a kind of a symbiotic relationship, although it is not entirely for nourishment for both the individuals, but they do remain in symbiosis where both of them are benefiting each other. So as we understand that insect pollinated flowers, they do have very showy bright colors. If not, at least they will have a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, or it will have some kind of a good or a bad smell that will attract the insects. Ornithophilous flowers are bird pollinated flowers. Now these flowers usually have mechanisms so that the bird can reach into the flower while pollen grains get stuck to it. And these flowers, for example, the flower which is pollinated by hummingbird does not need a landing device, because the hummingbird usually is hovering outside the flower and only the beak goes inside. However, there are flowers where the bird might land on the flower, and in such cases the flower will have to have a leathery, heavy, strong petal for the landing of small birds. Apart from this, we have malacophilous flowers, which are flowers that are pollinated by snails. We have elephophilous flowers, that are flowers which are pollinated by elephants. For example, rafflesia, when elephants walk in herd, they might stamp or place their feet on rafflesia, one flower, and then on the other, and it gets pollinated. We have chirapterophilous flowers. Chirapterophilous flowers are those which are pollinated by bats, those bats which are frugivorous, that is, they feed on flowers and fruits and vegetables, etc. They also act as pollinators. So those were the characteristics of pollination or flowers on the basis of how they are pollinated. Now let us talk about some of the contrivances of cross-pollination, meaning what are the characteristics of a flower that ensures that the flower does not carry out self-pollination and carries out cross-pollination. The outbreeding devices, or what we call contrivances of cross-pollination, are those characteristic features of a flower that ensure that the flower is not self-pollinated but cross-pollinated. The first such characteristic is called dicliny. Dicliny is a characteristic feature where the flowers are unisexual, so it has either male or female reproductive whorls in it, and the male and female flowers are not borne on the same plant. So if you have a plant which has unisexual flowers, but both male and female flowers are present on the same plant, then we call that plant monoecious, meaning there is only one kind of plant which has both male and female flowers. But those plants where there is a separate plant carrying all the male flowers, another plant carrying all the female flowers, we call such plants dioecious. Now if it is dioecious, of course the flowers are unisexual, then obviously there has to be cross-pollination. But if the flowers are unisexual but borne on the same plant, then you cannot ensure cross-pollination. Self-pollination can also occur if the pollen from a flower of that plant falls on the stigma of another flower but of the same plant. Okay, so this characteristic of having unisexual flowers in dioecious plants is called dicliny. The next characteristic is called protoandry or protogyny. So this is a characteristic where we see that in the same flower male and female reproductive organs are present, but the male reproductive organs mature before the female, or the female reproductive organ matures before the male reproductive organ. They do not mature at the same time. So if the male reproductive organ, that is the stamen, matures before the pistil has, we call it protandry. Andry meaning andrecium, pro meaning first. So here the andrecium is developing before the gynoecium. If the gynoecium, and at that point of time the gynoecium is not developed, so even if pollen grain is present, it cannot fertilize the gynoecium of the same flower, so it has to carry out cross-pollination. The reverse can also happen, that is the gynoecium develops before and the andrecium does not. So the gynoecium has developed, which is, we call it protogyny. So the gynoecium here has developed before the andrecium. So the gynoecium has to accept pollen grains from another stamen. It cannot wait for the pollen grain of the same flower. The next characteristic feature that ensures cross-pollination is called heterostyly. You know, sometimes the length of the stamen and the length of the style, they are in such a manner that it is not possible for the pollen grain to fall on the stigma of the same plant. So maybe the style of the gynoecium is longer, so the stigma is projected outside, whereas the pollen grains are inside. So there is no possibility that the pollen grain can travel out of the flower and fall on the stigma. This is called heterostyly, meaning the difference in length of the style and the stigma, and the filament of the stamen. After that, we have hercogamy. What is hercogamy? Hercogamy is a condition where there is actually a physical barrier separating the male and the female reproductive organs in one single flower, as a result of which the pollen grain cannot reach the stigma, right? And last but not the least, we have self-sterility. It has been seen that the pollen grain will only be able to fertilize or pass through the stigma for double fertilization if the pollen grain and the stigma, they are compatible. This compatibility depends on proteins present on the pollen grain and that present on the stigma. If they match, only then the pollen grain is allowed to form the pollen tube. So this, if it does not match, if the protein on the pollen grain and the protein on the stigma, they are not matching, they are not compatible, then even if the pollen grain falls on the stigma of the same flower, it will not germinate, and it will not fertilize the egg. We call this self-sterility or self-incompatibility. Some flowers have that incompatibility which ensures that it only carries out cross-pollination. To sum it all up, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. The advantages of cross-pollination, one is that it brings in variation. The moment there is cross-pollination, new combination of characteristics occur, as a result of which we get variety in the living world that will lead to evolution. Not only that, it has also been seen that when there is cross-pollination, there is something called hybrid vigor. Now, what is hybrid? Hybrid is a plant that has been produced, or an animal that has been produced by crossing two different species, two different varieties, two different genera. So, whenever there is cross-pollination, that is kind of hybridization. Let's say you are crossing a plant with red rose with another plant with white rose. They are of the same species, but they are two different varieties. So, when you are crossing them, we can get different colors. We might get a rose with red petal and white petals. We might get a rose with pink petals. We might get rose with white and pink, scattered here and there. That we don't know. But what we know is that this plant that has been produced is a hybrid. Usually it has been seen that these hybrids have very high pest resistance, they have very high resistance to diseases, and they are highly adapted to the environmental conditions. This is not the case if you carry out self-pollination for a very long time. Sometimes cross-pollination can also replace defective characteristic features. Most of those characteristic features which are not good for plants or animals, they stay in a subdued or a recessive condition. You have studied about genetics and you know what is dominance and recessive. So, most of those defective genes remain in a recessive condition. But when you carry out self-pollination, these recessive genes have a tendency of coming together because same kind of organisms are crossing. So, therefore, these recessive genes have a capacity of coming together and expressing themselves. Well, most of the cases, if you carry out cross-pollination, there will be a dominant gene masking the characteristic feature of this recessive gene. And that leads to getting rid of something called inbreeding depression. That is, when you carry out self-pollination for a very long time, it has been seen that this self-pollination, which we call inbreeding, where we are breeding within the same organism or the same group, then the recessive genes express, and these recessive genes might be disease causing, might be defective genes, might be genes which are not very good for survival or existence. So, always cross-pollination is preferred so that you do not end up expressing these harmful recessive genes. So, that was about all the natural methods of pollination. Apart from this, there is another type of pollination which is called artificial pollination. In artificial pollination, you can yourself take a brush, take the pollen grains from a male flower, dab it on the female flower to carry out pollination artificially between two flowers which would otherwise not naturally cross-pollinate. Something like this was already done by Mendel when he was crossing a tall pea plant with a dwarf pea plant, or a pea plant with yellow seeds with a pea plant with green seeds. So, pollination, as we understand, is an important way of making the male and the female gametes meet, and for that flowers are extremely well adapted. So, here is a homework question for you. Can you name a flower that is pollinated by male mosquitoes? Do let me know your answers by putting it in the comments below. I look forward to reading your answers and I promise to reply to them. Hope you enjoyed the video and learned from it. Do check out the courses on our website manochaacademy.com and our Android app Manocha Academy. Links are given below. We have courses on physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, coding and artificial intelligence. In these courses, you will get concept videos, live classes, quizzes, mock tests and revision notes. So, they will be perfect for your exam preparations. Links are all given below. Do hit the like button and share this video with your friends. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, go ahead and smash that subscribe button right now and click on the notification bell so that you do not miss out on any of our videos. Stay connected with Manocha Academy and let's keep learning together.